Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Carolyn, and I am the events manager here at Tricycle. This is the third today in a series of virtual conversations that we're hosting with Shambhala Publications around the new anthology, Secularizing Buddhism, New Perspectives on a Dynamic Tradition. Today's Zoom session will be recorded for anyone who's not able to attend live, and we'll make it available on Tricycle's YouTube channel. The link will be posted in the chat in case you'd like to share it with friends or if you'd like to watch the session again. Tricycle is providing these events for free, so if you'd like to support our work and other offerings like this, you can also donate to the link in the chat box. We'll also provide a link in the chat to 30% off the book, Secularizing Buddhism. So we will leave a bit of time for Q&A today at the end of this hour-long session, and you can ask your questions by typing them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. We will get to as many questions today as we can. So without further ado, our guests today are the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi and Gil Fronsdal. Bhikkhu Bodhi is an American Theravada Buddhist monk from New York City. He obtained a BA in philosophy from Brooklyn College and a PhD in philosophy from Claremont Graduate School. After completing his university studies, he traveled to Sri Lanka, where he received novice ordination in 1972 and full ordination in 1973. He's the president of the Buddhist Association of the United States, and he's the founder and chair of Buddhist Global Relief. Bodhi currently lives and teaches at the Chuang Yen Monastery in Carmel, New York. And Bhikkhu Bodhi today will be in conversation with Gil Fronsdal. Gil is the founding teacher and a co-guiding teacher at the Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City, California, and the Insight Retreat Center in Santa Cruz, California. Gil has been practicing Zen and Vipassana since 1975 and teaching since 1990. He has a PhD in Buddhist studies from Stanford. So we're really honored to have you both here. And without any further ado, I will hand it over to Gil.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Tricycle, for these panels and this opportunity to be in conversation with Bhikkhu Bodhi and to be here on this topic. And thank you, Bhikkhu Bodhi, for your essay in the Secularizing Buddhism, and I appreciated it quite a bit. What excited me the most was your last paragraph. And you know, you made these distinctions, loose distinctions between three different kinds of Buddhism, and then at the end you said that we should all unite, and all unite for the sake of if I make a little bit slightly humorous, maybe unite for imminent reasons, and I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about bringing the Buddhists together and how we could work together, and what are the commonalities you see that such a wide-ranging, philosophically maybe distinct groups can come together as Buddhists and work for the betterment of the world.
Yeah, well, I think in traditional Buddhism, there's been an emphasis when speaking about working for the benefit of the world. Usually it's formulated or expressed in terms of propagating the dharma as a system of individual or personal ethical training and mind training and meditative training. And so that is considered the way to benefit the world. But what I came to observe, particularly after I returned to the United States after spending some 20 years in Asia, the way Buddhism was being disseminated and formulated here in the United States, people were thinking of Buddhist practice, serious Buddhist practice means the kind of meditation that one is engaged with, to the neglect of what I would call the dimension of compassionate activity. And what particularly brought this to my attention, towards the end of the year 2004, it was actually the day after Christmas, 2004, a massive tsunami spread over South and Southeast Asia, creating quite a lot of damage, claiming many thousands of lives, particularly in Sri Lanka. I think thousands and thousands of people lost their lives. And so I decided, as a kind of under the voice of conscience, to try to raise funds to provide assistance to Sri Lanka. And so I sent an email to some of the people that were associated with the monastery where I was living at that time. But I also sent that same email to some friends of mine who had many connections, and they shared the email with their mailing lists to the point where within 2 weeks, we received $160,000 in donations. And then people were looking at me, the people at the monastery were looking at me to decide where to distribute these funds. And at the time, Google had prepared a master list of organizations that were providing relief aid to the countries of South and Southeast Asia. And so I thought I should distribute these funds to Buddhist organizations working in the area. And so I looked on that master list, and I believe I saw only 2 Buddhist organizations working, 2 or 3 Buddhist organizations providing relief aid to the victims of the tsunami. But many Christian organizations, several Jewish organizations, several Muslim organizations, and a large number of non-denominational secular organizations. And then that was scratching my conscience. Why is it that even though we always extol the virtue of compassion, loving kindness and compassion in Buddhism, and while we exemplify it in our individual behavior, and maybe in smaller social circles, but when it comes to large-scale relief aid, we don't find the same kind of Buddhist organizations comparable to Christian organizations like World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, Jewish organizations like World Jewish Services, Islamic Relief, and so on. Yeah, so that was a question that was sort of just deeply disturbing me. And I thought that first, one of the things that came out of those reflections in the year 2007, the Buddhist magazine Buddha Dharma asked me to write an editorial essay, which I wrote and published, in which I expressed my thoughts about that issue. And the editors, I just called it commentary, but the editors entitled it A Challenge to Buddhists, and it got published. And some of my students read that article and started to discuss amongst themselves the need to step up and face that challenge. And as a result of that, we formed the organization Buddhist Global Relief, dedicated to providing food aid to people around the world afflicted with chronic hunger and malnutrition. But I still see this as an ongoing problem or a challenge to Buddhists, to, especially under the conditions of modern life, where we find ourselves living in a very intensely integrated world, interconnected world, in which we really have to take on responsibility for what I would call promoting the common good in the most effective way, in ways that are consonant with the spirit of the Dharma. So as I say, despite the differences that separate traditional Buddhism, secular Buddhism, and then the new type that I classify, that I call imminent Buddhism, I think that these are at this task of addressing the real concrete suffering of the world due to poverty, economic injustice, increasing climate change, racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination, so forth, that this is a very real challenge, which is asking us to step up and to make our contribution. Mm. And I know in Buddhist Sanghas, there's an emphasis now on being more inclusive, having greater diversity, bringing in different voices from people of different racial groups, ethnic groups, different sexual orientations. And that's fine as far as it goes, but I think we also have to make a stronger impact on the world at large by directly addressing what we might call systems of oppression, exploitation, and destruction.
Very nice. Thank you very much. It's lovely to hear that history and what motivated you. I think, as you know, around the same time that you were doing Buddhist Global Relief here at IMC, we were creating a Insight World Aid. Yeah. So the Insight movement to have a humanitarian organization, and yours took off beautifully. Ours is kind of, it's still operating, but it's kind of teeny.
Yeah, I remember it was Jeff Harding
Yeah.
who was the one who came up with that idea. And he originally attended one of our BGR annual meetings, and I think that gave him the idea to.
Yeah. It's wonderful, and then this I was touched. I didn't know about the impact that the tsunami had on you in this kind of way.
Yeah.
In 2001, when there was a 9/11,
Mm.
in reflecting about it all, I thought that um, if the stronger the impact these kinds of things have on us, if we don't allow ourselves to be changed in some important way, we do a kind of harm to ourselves. And so I wondered, how can I be changed? What can I do differently after 9/11? And so we created here locally at IMC it's very different than what you did, but a chaplaincy training program to train people to be Buddhist chaplains in hospitals, prisons, and meet suffering at that level.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, in terms of this call you have, beautiful call you have to be involved in social action at different levels. Do you see there's a way that to hold these in harmony or mutuality, working together with the path to liberation?
Yeah, I would say that there can be a certain tension between those two ideals, because the path to liberation, whether it's following the Theravada model of aiming for transcendent liberation into Nibbana through arhatship, or the Mahayana vision of the Bodhisattva ideal aiming at the attainment of full Buddhahood, both models proceed from sila to samadhi to panya, to concentration and the development of direct insight meditation, or the development of wisdom through contemplative practices. And that involves necessarily some degree of seclusion, retreat, inner contemplation. And so even though I advocate strongly for the need for Buddhists to be more actively engaged in promoting the common good and the well-being of the world, I would not try to impose that as a single model that's valid and applicable to everybody. There will be a wide diversity of temperaments amongst people who are following the Buddhist path. And so if people are more inclined towards a life of renunciation and secluded meditative cultivation, I don't want to demand that they have to abandon their seclusion and adopt a more active way of life, because people have different inclinations and temperaments. But what I would say is that as a general sort of tendency, or let's say a general obligation, there's a need for contemporary Buddhism to manifest the spirit of compassion in active engagement with the world, transformation of social and economic structures that bring along oppression, exclusion, and environmental destruction.
Nice. But I do wonder if some of the benefits that come from benefits in terms of being on the path to liberation that comes from being in seclusion and deep meditation, can some of those benefits be found in ways of doing social action?
Maybe the question not fully clear to me. Maybe can you reformulate it?
Yeah. So for me, just a very simple example, I teach a lot of meditation retreats.
Yeah.
And many people in the beginning of a retreat are working through their hindrances.
Yeah.
And becoming wise about the hindrances. But I wonder if you can become just as wise about hindrances doing social action, active in the world, if you orient yourself to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
And so that the social action work can be seen as being on the path to liberation as well.
I would say it's a more indirect route, but I would also say it's perhaps a more powerful route and one with greater long-term benefits. Let us say that the path of strict renunciation, detachment, contemplation is a kind of swift path to personal liberation, to individual liberation. But I would say that this path of engaging in compassionate, beneficent action, it, to the extent that it makes claims on one's time, one doesn't have the time to devote to one's own personal contemplative practice, but one could find a healthy balance between the two, which enables one to develop what I call the inner power, the strength, inner spiritual power, which one can then bring out to one's activities, engaged in one's activities of one's expressions of social engagement. And though it might involve a longer and slower route to liberation, one extended over many lives, perhaps, it will be a way of cultivating what we call the paramis or paramitas, particularly dana or generosity, aspects of sila, certainly involves a lot of virya energy and kanti patience, metta loving kindness, adhitthana determination, and upekkha equanimity. So all of those qualities that constitute paramis or paramitas will be developed through that engagement, providing it's done under the aegis, under the umbrella of dedication to the ultimate goal of the Buddha's path.
So if I dare to kind of restate it, what you're saying, which you said it so beautifully, is that if we could do something like the meditation practice to create a foundation of self-understanding and understanding of practice, then we can practice maybe letting go of clinging in our activities in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's like for me, I was monastic for 10 years, and I loved it. And maybe for my personality, it was a little bit too easy, but it's really nice. And then I left, and at some point I had children, and that was hard.
Yeah.
And I had to learn a lot. I had to learn a whole different level of letting go, or about clinging and attachment that I didn't learn in the monastery. Yeah. And then I'm also, as the world becomes more, this impact of climate change and racism and all this is becoming more felt by many of us. There's a whole new level of attachments to discover, and that I wouldn't have discovered if I stayed in the monastery. Yeah. But the monastery time prepared me to recognize the where I was attached and recognize the willingness to face it. And
and I would say maybe sometimes the idea of detachment and non-attachment gets formulated in maybe too much of a radical way that forestalls the possibility of active engagement in the world. Like I would say certain types of attachment, I would say, are healthy and necessary. To be attached to the ideal that the fruits, let's say the fruits of our economic system should be available to everybody, or to put it in terms that are very meaningful right now, attached to the idea that the COVID vaccine should be distributed all over the world so that people in every country will be vaccinated against the vaccine.
Yeah.
The idea that we should be attached to the life-sustaining or human-sustaining capacities of this planet, so that we don't just continue to allow the fossil fuel corporations to exploit the natural resources, the fossil fuels, and burn them and destroy the prospects for human civilization on this planet. So certain types of attachment, I would say, should be cultivated.
Maybe. I mean, certainly it's better than the alternative. Sometimes. So in that sense, yes. But I'm content with the idea that we don't have to be attached to do these things. There can be a powerful commitment.
Well, maybe commitment is the word that I'm really looking for, but I'm just using the word attachment in that way to underscore as a counterfoil to the idea that we should be completely detached, in the sense of completely withdrawn from any concern for the well-being of the world.
Great. So just to step back a moment as a little bit the moderator here, I do see popping up questions and comments so long as we go along. And my understanding was from Bhikkhu Bodhi and I to first be in kind of discussion for a while, and then we'll go over to the questions. And I hope that's okay with people. I want, we want to have plenty of time for your comments as well. So that's just let you know what's happening here. And so then the title of our panel, Bhikkhu Bodhi, is preserving the path to liberation.
Yeah.
And as a Dharma teacher, that's the central thing that I'm kind of, at the core, the organizing principle of all this liberation and the path to liberation. And as a Dharma teacher, part of the question is, how much do I do? How much do I focus on that? And how much do I focus on all the other things that caring for society might be about? And where do we find the balance for this?
I think we each have to sort of follow our own, let's say, our own aptitudes, our own capacities, our own dispositions. Like, even though I helped to found the Buddhist Global Relief and I'm the chair of the organization, but I'm not the workhorse of the organization. We have a team, a very excellent team, or a staff of lay people who are maintaining the day-to-day work. And we have a very wide range of people who volunteer for the organization, and they contribute, on a more active day-to-day level. And I am the lazy one who does Buddhist research and translation, but I provide, I would say I provide ideas, motivation, and inspiration for the organization.
Nice. And but I do worry sometimes that the emphasis on social action, I have the same fear around Buddhism and social action, which I think is great and very important. I love what you said today, but I have some fear that's similar to fear that you have for imminent Buddhism, I think, or secular Buddhism, is that the path of liberation is lost.
Yeah. Yeah, that is certainly a danger, a possibility, but this is where we have to balance socially engaged work with first a commitment to personal practice and personal cultivation, and also, as I tried to explain earlier, to fit engaged activity, socially engaged activity, within the broad framework of the Buddhist path to liberation. And there are different strategies for doing this. One, which I'm not particularly fond of, but which would fit into a model of traditional Buddhism, is that one is doing this as a way of generating merit. And why I have some reservations about this. I mean, I believe strongly as a traditional Buddhist in the reality of something like merit, but I don't see myself as doing this in order to accumulate a store of merits that I will have a happy rebirth in the future and be wealthy and powerful and influential and so forth. And I don't think any of the people on our team are doing this with the idea of accumulating merits that will further their own personal well-being in future existences. But that could, within a traditional framework, that could provide one source of justification. Another is fitting it into the model of developing paramis or paramitas, which, whether one is following the classical bodhisattva ideal or the arahat ideal, paramitas are still considered the fuel, so to speak, that lifts off the rocket ship of personal practice and propels it into the space of realization and higher attainments.
Great, thank you.
And then also the third way is one could see this as, if I use a model of ascending movement of the spiritual life and descending movement, where the ascending movement is a movement of primarily of wisdom, moving to higher levels or to deeper levels. And the descending movement is the outflow of loving kindness and compassion that is awakened and generated by that unfolding of wisdom, which flows down and out into the world in the form of compassionate activity.
Nice, very nice. I think that I like the metaphor of depth and width. So there's we go deep in practice, but also we can go wide, and the wide is hopefully bringing that depth wide so that it touches the whole world.
Yeah.
This is beautiful. Thank you, Bhikkhu Bodhi. I so much value this orientation that you have, and you know, this is something that I appreciate so much that you're championing and writing about. Thank you. So
and I should say that when I was a monk at Sri Lanka, I never envisaged anything like this happening. Yeah. My forte, my sort of area of specialization was the study of canonical texts and translation and meditation. But it's when I became the editor for the Buddhist Publications Society that I saw, especially living in Sri Lanka at a time when an ethnic war was going on, that I saw the necessity to promulgate Buddhist values in a way that would contribute to ethnic harmony and peace. And then especially after returning to the United States, when I had a much wider exposure through the internet to what is going on in the world, that I saw the need for more articulate expressions of a socially engaged Buddhism as a way of addressing the vast amounts of what I call the concrete, tangible suffering that afflicts billions of people around the world every day.
Nice, nice. So you have been dedicated much of your life to translation and writing about the teachings. And so there's a third channel here in a sense. There's a channel of retreats, practice, seclusion we talked about, practice of social engagement. And then I don't know if it's between those two, or a third channel is that of really spending a lot of time with the suttas, which both of us have done. And so I'm curious to hear, what value does that have for you, and why have you spent these decades immersed in these texts?
Well, when I went to Sri Lanka, I never had the intention to become a translator. Again, this happened almost through a series of unexpected incidents. First, the role, before I come to my own personal story, the role of translation in preserving the Dhamma. Let us say that from the time of the Buddha himself, there was recognized a strong need for the preservation of the teachings and their transmission from generation to generation. And so it wasn't the case that all of the monks who learned the Dhamma from the Buddha and from the great disciples went off exclusively into seclusion to develop their own practice, to attain arhatship, and then spend the rest of their time dwelling in the palasamapatti, in the meditative absorption, the fruit. But there were teams, apparently, of monks and nuns who specialized in memorizing the teachings, because the teachings were not written down in books in that period, but were preserved through memory and then transmitted orally from one generation to the next. And so there would have been teams of monastics who devoted their lives to memorizing the teachings in companies and then transmitting them to their circle of students. And then once writing became the medium for preserving the teachings, there would be, again, large teams of monks in each who would always be copying the texts on these oleolith manuscripts, which had to be rewritten every few years because in the Asian climate, the manuscripts would be attacked by different types of insects and by changes in the climate. Okay, so then my personal story. So when I went to Sri Lanka, my main intention was to learn the teachings, to go, and I wanted to read the teachings themselves, the Nikayas, and then to be able to read them in the original language. But to aid me in reading them, I relied on the translations of the Pali Text Society, but I couldn't understand them because they were written in this archaic, almost sometimes the Chaucerian style of English, or Elizabethan style of English. And so to assist myself in understanding them, I started to write them out. And then when I had some questions, I would bring them to an elder German monk, the monk Venerable Nyanaponika Mahatera, to ask him questions. Then he saw the translations that I was doing, and he said, "These are very good, you should continue with that." And then I continued doing some translations of suttas with commentary and sub-commentary. And then about the year 1985, when Wisdom Publications was just getting started, they wrote to Venerable Nyanaponika, I was living with him at the time, asking if he would prepare for publication. He knew that they knew that Venerable Nyanamoli had left behind a handwritten translation of the Majjhima Nikaya. And so the executive director of Wisdom at that time, Nick Rebush, wrote to Venerable Nyanaponika saying, could you prepare Nyanamoli's translation of the Majjhima Nikaya for publication? And Venerable Nyanaponika wrote back, he said, I'm now 84 years old, and he was losing his vision. He had lost his vision in one eye, but I have a young American monk staying with me. At that time, I was just, I just turned 40 years old, so I was still young. Who's very good in Pali. I could give him that task. And then I took over that task. Nice. And then from there led to one other thing and to another thing.
Nice, nice. So before we take questions from the audience, I have one more question, which is a little bit personal. And I feel a little bit that maybe I'm allowed to ask some personal, because in your wonderful essay in the book, you do an analysis of the forces, the social forces that brought about secular Buddhism or imminent Buddhism. And that was very nice to see that. I'm wondering if your particular way of understanding traditional Buddhism or Buddhism, if it has its own kind of conditioning from your background, that if you were going to write your own chapter about the conditioning that went into place, like you did in this chapter, what would you say about what your background is that influenced your interpretation of traditional Buddhism?
Okay, when I first became interested in Buddhism when I was in college, senior year in college. And at that time, the books that were available and which I was reading, which influenced my understanding of Buddhism, were some works of D.T. Suzuki on Zen Buddhism, and then the writings of his Anglo-American interpreter, Alan Watts. And that was my primary source of knowledge of Buddhism. But my interest had already been aroused. And I pretty much accepted, well, Alan Watts gave some arguments, maybe not arguments, but presented his interpretation that rebirth was a kind of metaphor, basically for the way all things are interconnected, something like that. It's not fresh in my mind. And so I accepted that was because I found it difficult at that time to accept the idea of rebirth or a karma operating beyond an individual life. But then when I went to graduate school, I came to live, a Buddhist monk from Vietnam came to study at the same university in Claremont Graduate School. And I became friends with him, and he became my first Buddhist teacher. And we ordered the publications of the Pali Text Society, the early translations of the Nikayas. And once I started to read the Buddhist teachings, the canonical teachings, I saw that it was very clear to me that the Buddha taught the literal rebirth and the working of karma beyond an individual lifetime. Then I just had no trouble at all accepting, like, this is the word of the Buddha, I accept it.
I couldn't wonder whether your study of John Locke had some influence on some of your interpretation or some of your
I don't think so. I did my doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of John Locke, not his political philosophy, but his the concept of primary and secondary qualities.
I see.
In the early chapters of his essay on, now I don't even remember, essay on human understanding.
So that you didn't carry that with you into your study of Buddhism?
No, I don't think so.
I have wondered whether John Locke's political views, liberalism, had some bearing on your wonderful interest in social engagement.
I don't think it was John Locke, but at the time when I was in Sri Lanka, some of the people that I was reading through a friend in Europe. I had a subscription to a magazine published in the UK called Resurgence.
Yes, I read it too.
You did, really?
Yes.
It was edited by, he was actually formerly a Jain monk. He was originally from India, but living in Britain. And he came out of, like, the one that they regarded as their model, their inspiration was Schumacher, who wrote the book.
Small is Beautiful.
Small is Beautiful, yeah. And so it was the writings in that journal that influenced my thinking a lot. And then I had ordered through that journal a number of books that were published by, I think, Resurgence Publications. I don't remember the titles, but they were kind of critiques of the global economy, critiques of corporate capitalism.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great, great. So I appreciate this so much, Bhikkhu Bodhi, and it seems to be we overlap in good number of ways. And even though I might be, I wouldn't call myself imminent, but
Yeah.
I'm if you want to call me that, I'm fine. And but we overlap so much, and I appreciate this overlap and value so much.
Yeah. Maybe one point I should make also is that sometimes when we have these distinctions, traditional religious Buddhism, imminent Buddhism, secular Buddhism, but probably from the traditional religious Buddhists, 90% of their Buddhist concerns, activities, involvements are imminent involvements. It's just primarily the background and the aspiration that singles them out as traditional, or I prefer actually classical mainstream Buddhists. So the background understanding is that of multiple lives, multiple realms and dimensions of existence, and an aspiration, in the case of Theravadins, generally towards the liberation of Nibbana or Arhatship. In the case of traditional Mahayana Buddhists, the aspiration to follow the superior bodhisattva path towards Buddhahood.
Great, and with that as a background and foundation, people have lived a rich, valuable religious life and social life, ethical life that certainly inspires me.
Yeah. And maybe this will be a little anecdotal, but one way in which I came to overcome, in my way of thinking, the objections that secular Buddhists and maybe imminent Buddhists, to the extent they're reflective on this issue, have to the idea of other realms of existence and realms of rebirth. There was one little incident that happened to me in Sri Lanka that gave me, to my mind, an excellent analogy for this way of thinking. When I was living in the Hermitage in Sri Lanka, the way I would get my information about the world was through a little radio that somebody had gifted to me with shortwave radio bands. And every evening I would turn on the radio. It would be on shortwave radio band 1, and the dial would be set to BBC World Service. And it came through very clearly, even in the forest outside Kandy in Sri Lanka. And then I would listen to the evening news for about 15 minutes. Okay, but one evening, I turned on the radio and I didn't get the BBC World Service. And I was wondering what's going on. And then I moved the dial all the ways along the band from left to right, couldn't get the BBC World Service. And I was wondering, what's wrong? Why am I not getting it? Then I realized what I must have done was to shift the band control from shortwave 1 to FM. And the BBC was not coming in on FM. And so I thought of the sort of analogy, somebody who doesn't see other realms of existence, doesn't see the operation of rebirth claims, not real. It's purely imaginary. And then I imagined somebody who couldn't get the BBC World Service on the FM radio band saying, "You're talking about BBC World Service? Unreal, imaginary, superstition, something
Fantastic.
supernatural."
Fantastic. I love it. Thank you so much. Let's see about the questions. I'll look now and see what we can do with the questions here. And there's questions and chats. I'm not sure how to manage those, but the
I see 15 in the Q&A box.
Christianity has a parable of helping strangers. Does Buddhism have similar stories?
In fact, there is a list of qualities that are said to be objects of reverence, mentioned several places in the Anguttara Nikaya, the book of the collection of numerical discourses. There are 7 things that are said to be worthy of reverence: Buddha, Dharma, Sangha training, and one of them is hospitality. And so within, say, the Buddhist monastic order, if a monk comes visiting a monastery, he's to be treated with full hospitality. You're given a room, the refreshment, water for drinking and washing the face and feet and so forth. So hospitality plays an important role within the monastic life. And in general Indian society, I think it was not so necessary for the Buddha to mention this, because hospitality towards strangers was just part of Indian culture. That said that next to God, the one who should be God and parents, the one who should be treated with the utmost reverence is the stranger or the visitor, the guest.
Nice, thank you. Does the term sentient being include animals? Are there any Buddhist organizations working for the welfare of wildlife and all animals?
Yeah, first sentient being certainly includes animals, and there is an organization called Buddhist Voices for Animals. The person can use Google to search for it.
So religious organizations organized to help individuals inside and outside their congregation are, I believe, relatively recent, in the last 300 to 400 years. Prior to that, individual saints did things, but not organizations. Is this because powerful, rich organizations are relatively recent, and did Buddhism have a similar history?
Okay, I just have to give a speculative answer to this, but I would say that in the traditional cultures, the responsibility for providing for the welfare of the population at large rested primarily with the monarch. And the Buddha, the Buddhist texts establish a model of what you might call a socially beneficent monarchy by holding up as the ideal what is called the Raja Chakravarti, the wheel-turning king or wheel-turning monarch, whose responsibility is to promote the well-being and happiness of all in his realm. And then the text will mention the samanas and brahmanas, the ascetics and brahmins, how the kshatriyas, the administrators, the householders, and even the birds and the beasts. Mm-hmm. And I say that that model probably held the figure of the wheel-turning monarch, the Raja Chakravarti, probably was considered sort of paradigmatic for traditional Asian political systems, even though rarely followed to the T, up till the time of the colonial conquest of Buddhist Asian countries.
Great, thank you. And apparently many people are asking about, because they haven't read the book yet, that this is, what do you mean by imminent Buddhism?
Okay. Okay, so I drew a distinction between traditional Buddhism and secular Buddhism. And then what I said, I wonder if I could take the liberty, I have my chapters. Okay, so I make an initial distinction between traditional Buddhism and secular Buddhism. Then I say, I believe this dichotomy of traditional Buddhism and secular Buddhism conceals a third alternative that may actually be the most prevalent expression of Buddhism in the West today. This is what I call imminent Buddhism, by which I mean an approach to the Dharma that avoids doctrinal issues to focus almost exclusively on existential and psychological aims. So the Dharma is practiced in this mode is essentially a set of tools for transforming the mind and healing our inner wounds. And then I say that, and this is an important point, that imminent Buddhism is not a self-defined movement. So to my knowledge, there are no people who come forward and say, I'm an imminent Buddhist, and what I am advocating is imminent Buddhism. So maybe after the book is published, such a movement might emerge. But I say that it's an orientation that operates below the threshold of conscious recognition. And so this would be the a kind of focus, a kind of a way of adopting Buddhism, which focuses entirely or almost entirely on imminent concerns relating to the present life, especially on maybe saying maximizing well-being or human flourishing within this life itself, primarily through, say, psychological transformation, ethical and psychological transformation, by following principles of the Buddhist path and putting to the side and outside the purview of concern what we might call the transcendent teachings of classical Buddhism, concerned with enlightenment and liberation, the attainment of a world transcending nirvana.
Great. And so I'm trying to find my way through these questions. It's a little, I apologize to everyone who's listening that it's a little slow for me to track them. Now I'm trying to track both the chat and the Q&A. So, Bhikkhu Bodhi, if you see them and want to jump in, then you're welcome to do that to help out there.
Okay, let's see. Okay, we have animals.
Do you both feel that some types of social engagement fit better with Buddhism than others? For example, apolitical food aid versus supporting dissident civil society groups in places like Burma? Or any types that you feel might be the most promising opportunities at this time?
Wait, go say that again.
Yeah, do you feel that some types of social engagement fit better with Buddhism than others? For example, apolitical food aid versus supporting dissident civil society groups in places like Burma. Are any types that you feel might be the most promising opportunities at this time? So I imagine, for example, some people wanted to be engaged in social actions with violence, and some people that might be not really work for classic Buddhist.
Yeah, certainly a proper Buddhist approach to any kind of social engagement would avoid the use of violence. But maybe we could make a distinction of two modes in which socially engaged Buddhism might operate. One is in the mode of what we might call humanitarian or philanthropic assistance. And this maybe resonates more easily with Buddhists coming from a traditional background, because it gives in a clearer, more explicit, less provocative way opportunities to express the qualities like loving kindness and compassion and action. So these would be forming charities, providing food assistance, the way Buddhist Global Relief does, educational assistance, medical assistance, disaster relief, like the very admirable Taiwan-based organization, the Tsuji Foundation. Okay, the other aspect of or side of Buddhist social engagement would aim at more maybe radical social, economic, and political transformation or systemic transformation, aiming to change systems and institutions to promote greater social, economic, racial, and political, and even legal justice. And perhaps that is a bit more difficult for traditional Buddhists, though this is what I would say is particularly obligatory for us to take up today, but doing so from a perspective of nonviolence, but being willing to speak up, to challenge, to reject, repudiate systems seem to be destructive, unjust, exploitative, and to promote alternative systems. And that is something I think that most of us, I'd conclude myself as well, are not very familiar with and perhaps need to become better acquainted with. And certainly the situation going on in Myanmar right now, which is a heartrending and tragic situation, which unfortunately, because it's been going on since the beginning of February, the first month or so, it gets a lot of publicity. Then when it becomes an ongoing conflict, then it drops out of the news. To find out more about it, you have to go to specialized news sources. But also I have to say, it's very difficult to see what we can do for living in another country can do except provide some financial assistance through the channel like the International Network of Engaged Buddhists or Alan Sinauki's Clear View Project, who are channeling funds to the resistance in Myanmar.
I'm inspired by some of the teachings on speech in the 10 skillful actions,
Yeah.
where the emphasis is on speaking in ways that unify people and avoiding speech which is divisive.
Yeah.
And so in terms of social engagement, even ones that are political or trying to do systemic change, I would wish to see that we would find some way to do it that's certainly passionate and committed and right against where the tensions are, but to always focus on where the unification can happen and not perpetuating the divisions.
Yeah, of course, that's a beautiful ideal, but sometimes, maybe this is my own temperament, that you have to speak up very clearly, truthfully, and even a bit forcefully to get one's point across when you see that the injustice being perpetrated and perpetuated.
So I think my answer to the question about, that just we asked is that I wouldn't feel so supportive of organizations were actively perpetuating things that are divisive. But divisiveness, actively, sometimes speaking strongly, like you just talked about, there's no intention to be divisive, but the way it's received, the people receive it, choose to use it divisively.
Yeah, of course, one should try to be as skillful as possible and try to appeal to the decent side of other people in order to awaken their capacities for empathy, and you at least to try to instill some humility in them to be open to other points of view. But sometimes it's very difficult.
Yes. So I think we have just 5 minutes left, Bhikkhu Bodhi, and I want to see, do you have anything that you would like to say that you'd feel maybe, that you wish you had a chance before we ended?
Mm.
Following up on something we've talked about already, or anything about what brought us together here?
I thought perhaps we could see if there's any further questions.
Sure, sure. I'll keep going through. There are lots of questions. So, do Buddhist organizations try to educate politicians as one approach to create positive change?
The Buddhists try to educate politicians to bring about positive change.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of anybody doing that, though I heard that there's a representative from Ohio, Tim Ryan, who is a mindfulness meditator and advocate of mindfulness. Though I don't think he's a Buddhist himself, but he found the mindfulness practice to be personally beneficial.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I wonder.
I remember that years ago, hearing that Thich Nhat Hanh had given talks to the members of Congress, and somebody sent me perhaps about a year ago, was a photograph taken in Vietnam, because Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh had returned to his home monastery in Vietnam, and a number of senators, including Lisa Murkowski from Alaska and I think Patrick Leahy from Vermont, and a few others, had flown to Vietnam to visit him. It was very impressive.
Yes, yeah. I'm intrigued by the possibility of somehow offering teachings in Buddhist ethics, in a sense, and applying it to social issues for people who are involved in politics. That would be intriguing. So I think we've come to the end, and first I want to apologize to those of you who wrote questions and didn't get answered. It was, there's many of them. I appreciate the interest and all that, and would have been nice to have had time for all of them. And I just love the opportunity to spend time with Bhikkhu Bodhi, and thank you so much for making your time available.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
And so Caroline.
Thank you both so much for that really thought-provoking conversation. I could see just from the huge volume of questions that we're really touching on some things that are really important to all of us in our practice and how we take our practice out into the world. So thank you again to both of you for your time. I just wanted to let everyone know that we have another conversation coming up tomorrow at 3 p.m. and that's on the question of rebirth in modern Buddhism with Roger Jackson and Jay Garfield. And again, we are providing these sessions for free. So if you feel moved to donate, please consider donating at tricycle.org/donate. We'll put a link in the chat box. And don't forget that you can receive 30% off Secularizing Buddhism, another link in the chat box. And we will be offering replays of this session up on our YouTube channel. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Bhikkhu Bodhi. Thank you, Gil. And hope to see you all at our event tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you again, Gil and Carolyn.